Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining this crisis group event in which we'll be discussing the evolution of the security architecture in the Indo-Pacific, and more specifically, how the growing competition between China and the United States is affecting security dynamics in the region. My name is Pierre Prakash. I'm the director of the Asia program at Crisis Group, and I'll be moderating today's conversation, for which we have an excellent panel lined up. I'll introduce our panelists in a minute, but before I do, I just wanted to briefly introduce our organization. For those of you who are not familiar with International Crisis Group, we are a policy-oriented advocacy organization focused on conflict prevention and conflict resolution. We have a network of analysts based around the world, and our research methodology includes speaking to all conflict actors in order to come up with pragmatic and actionable recommendations for those conflict actors geared towards preventing, resolving, and a lot of the time mitigating the impact of conflicts on civilians around the world. I'd now like to introduce our panelists. We first have Ms. Lee Sue Ann, who's a senior fellow and the coordinator of regional, strategic, and political studies at the Singapore-based ICS Yusof Ishak Institute. My apologies. I'm sure that institute will be familiar to many of you following Southeast Asia. Mr. Mark Lambert, who was until recently the China coordinator and deputy assistant secretary in the Bureau of East Asia and Pacific Affairs at the U.S. State Department, and therefore has extensive experience in dealing with U.S. policy in much of Asia. Dr. Huang Lei-Tu, the Asia Program's Deputy Director at International Crisis Group, who has extensive background on Asian geopolitics with a particular focus on Southeast Asia. And last but not least, Ali Wine, Senior Research and Advocacy Advisor on U.S. China relations in International Crisis Group's U.S. program. So we have about an hour ahead of us. Start with discussion with the panelists, which I'll moderate for about 35 minutes, and then we'll open the floor for a Q&A session with the audience. If you want to ask a question, please do so by typing it in the QA box at the bottom of your screen. And please mention your name and affiliation when you do so, if possible. And I just want to highlight, you can ask questions throughout the session. You don't need to wait until the end of the panel to do so. And before we start, please note this event will be recorded and live streamed on Crisis Group's YouTube channel. Now let's dive in. We at Crisis Group have actually just published a report titled Asia in Flux, the U.S., China, and the Search for a New Equilibrium, which is actually the opening piece of a series of reports we'll be publishing in coming months, looking at how various countries in the region, particularly U.S. allies, are reevaluating their defense requirements and shifting their defense postures. And the objective of this research is not just to document these evolutions, but also to try to identify or better understand what is driving these shifts we are currently witnessing in many parts of this region. And this first report sort of sets the scene by looking at some of the common drivers behind this trend, particularly China's growing military capabilities and assertiveness in the region on one side, and on the other, the growing sense that the U.S. may not be as reliable as it used to be in playing its role as the region's security guarantor, so to say, a trend which has been underway for some time, but has arguably deepened in the last few months, given both President Trump's transactional approach to foreign policy, which has some allies in the region a little concerned, and more broadly, I would say, the uncertainties around his administration's policies for the region, since beyond the question of trade and tariffs, President Trump hasn't really turned his attention to Asia just yet. Huang, I'm going to turn to you to kick things off. As I mentioned, we just published this report. Can you quickly run us through the main findings of that research and talk to us about the current state of the U.S.-China military competition and how it's affecting the regional power of balance in Asia?
Thank you,
Balance
Pierre.
of power. Sorry.
Well, it is unquestionable by now that the security landscape in the region has been evolving, and there are growing concerns across the region, although not without nuances. And obviously, we are hoping to highlight these nuances in the upcoming series. But there are certain commonalities that can be detected, and the trend of strengthening deterrence and military upgrade across the region, especially among the U.S. treaty allies, but also some of the partners in the region, is the apparent trend. Obviously, there are, and this is going to be focus of the series as Pierre introduced. And obviously, there are other factors like domestic politics, change in the leadership within the countries that change their postures as well as their economic capabilities and ambitions as they grow in the status of middle powers that also want to upgrade and update their technological and defense military hardware. So we have been thinking about those issues for quite some time, even before the return of President Trump to the office, and which obviously instilled further uncertainties. But this collective project, this series, has been in the making for a long time, as we detected those trends already happening across Indo-Pacific. And this series will involve a number of our experts. This report particularly already involves some of our former and current experts as well. So the release of this first report really marks what we call a new era, an era where unpredictability in global geopolitics is the new normal. The first report sets out the current state of great power competition, especially focusing on the military and security aspect of U.S. China relations and what that means for the region. So first, we highlighted the leap in China's military capability and progress in many domains that now are able to rival the world's most powerful military, which is the United States. So in fact, in some aspects, China arguably already exceeded the United States, for example, in the naval power, when it comes to number of ships, at least. Its missiles can now temporarily shut down US bases in the region or block US aircraft carriers from entering China's neo seas, move to impede US freedom to maneuver and complicate actually US decision-making in the event of war. Improvements that China in space and cyber and nuclear capabilities had made would make it difficult for the United States and its allies to fight and win a war in the region, and certainly raises the cost considering to getting into one. China's military spending in the recent decade really skyrocketed. Currently, China's military spending alone exceeds 22 other Asian nations altogether. But it's still dwarfed by US military spending, which is the world's largest by far. Under President Trump's first term, the US adopted the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, aiming at supporting international rules-based order, but rejecting any revisionist attempt to alter that order by force. And so China was recognized as a peer and strategic competitor. Under the Biden administration, the US invested more in collective deterrence, strengthening partners and allies' capabilities, and expanded so-called lattice work in the Indo-Pacific, where unilateral, multilateral, and plurilateral strategic cooperation initiative multiplied alongside with those bilateral alliance commitments. But military posture is only part of the story in our report. The report goes in depth in interpreting the changing intentions both in China and Washington and US. China has tended to use that military might to press on neighboring countries, especially in the disputed areas. So at times we saw violation of international law, we see increased military activities and exercises. Some even refer to them as rehearsals of military operations in the Taiwan Strait, incursion in space and territorial waters, or even disruption of natural exploitation of resources in the exclusive economic zones in the South China Sea, for example. So we see a trend of danger, of becoming a more dangerous contested region, and that raises the probability of unintended accidents and incidents that may further escalate. And so the return of President Trump and his America First foreign policy has been a source of anxiety for many allies and partners in the region, including Asia. I won't go into the details because the rest of the panel will unpack that. But there, for Asia, it's mildly perhaps reassuring because it's not on top of the list of his attention. But at the same time, there are risks like eroding trust among the allies or confusing partners simply, or even emboldening China's ambition. So there are a number of implications that we can unpack in the discussion, but I wanted to wrap up this session, this point by saying that the Indo-Pacific allies, especially Japan, South Korea, Philippines, and Australia, which this series will focus on, but also a number of other partners would find themselves in a very vulnerable position where security threats are growing, but security reassurance is under question. So we are reckoning with happening. There is a reckoning happening among the allies and partners in the region to update their defense policies, to upgrade their capabilities, to invest more in acquisition and production. And ultimately, all of that will contribute to the reshaping of the regional security architecture. I'll leave it here and looking forward to further discussion with you.
Thanks, Wong. And indeed, as you pointed out, I mean, this is something that's very much in flux at the moment. And we see these countries, various countries that you just touched upon and others as well, recalibrating, and some are longer term trends and some are actually also shaping up as we speak. I'm going to turn to Sue-Ann. Thank you for joining us, Sue-Ann from Singapore. As I mentioned, you're affiliated with the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, or ICES, and in the 2025 edition of the flagship ICES regional survey, which tracks the region's mood on a series of issues, the top geopolitical concern for the whole Southeast Asia region was aggressive behavior in the South China Sea. And while I think China is not specifically mentioned in the answer there, I think that clearly points to China's gray zone activities in the South China Sea, particularly close to the Philippines, but in other places as well. Can you lay out for us briefly how China's increased military activities and assertiveness affect the views in the region on the questions of peace and security broadly?
Thanks. Thanks for having me, Pierre. And good morning and evening to everyone. So to that question, I think the reason why, excuse me again for my throat, the reason why the South China Sea issue has become, again, the top geopolitical concern is really because of concerns that this issue has now become a proxy issue for the U.S. China contestation in the region. And that this could trigger a broader U.S. China conflict that could drag in the rest of the Southeast Asian countries into that conflict. The South China Sea issue, as we know, is a long-standing brewing issue with skirmishes all across the years. But why is it now the top issue? It's really because I think of it's a proxy issue for the U.S.-China competition. The Chinese themselves see it this way. And those of us watching the issue would already notice and would know that the approach to the Philippines as a claimant state and all of the skirmishes that you see in the region, Scarborough Shoal and all of that, is very different from the approaches taken to Vietnam or even Malaysia. Vietnam has been quietly building stuff on their sort of like reefs and doing reclamation, but not a lot of Chinese pushback on that in the way that you sort of see the China-Philippines skirmishes grabbing the headlines. So I think really the way the Chinese see it is that the Philippines has been emboldened by the US or is drawing in the US in a way that is provocative and destabilizes the region. And maybe at this point, it may be useful for me to just make some broader points about how the region generally sees the US-China strategic dynamic, right? And I like to think of it as it's a little bit like that Goldilocks dilemma. The region has traditionally wanted to see a sweet spot between the U.S. China striking some sort of a grand bargain that could potentially undermine or trade off the region's security concerns. So that's on one end, right? We fear that grand bargain that would marginalize regional interests and perhaps undermine regional agency, versus on the other end of the spectrum, if things get too hot and there's a conflict that breaks out and everyone gets dragged in. And so traditionally, people are wanting that sweet spot. Where are we in today in this continuum? It's really hard to say. There are conflicting signals for all the reasons that have been laid out in Hong's paper. President Trump is clearly very keen on striking a deal with President Xi. You know, some people are even saying that Trump perhaps would be keen on entertaining that grand bargain. Trump has, you know, often said that he really likes and respects President Xi, and that between the U.S. and China, they could, you know, solve much of the world's problems. And so really, this is kind of like an invitation to you know, to say, come deal with me, come strike that deal. And of course, we know that actually the phone never rang, and after a while, it's like, why are they not calling? And so, you know, but people have been trying to sort of say this could actually be a window of opportunity for China to strike a deal with President Trump, who perhaps doesn't seem to be as ideologically opposed to China as some of the hawks that might be present in the US system. But as we know, there are probably very good reasons to be very skeptical about this. You know, would President Trump be able to carry it? And really all indications from the Chinese people that I've talked to is that the Chinese side just remains extremely wary, distrustful and skeptical, you know, about any sort of a grand bargain, right? And so what are we dealing with in the region? I think we may actually be dealing, therefore, with almost the worst of both scenarios. So at a tactical level, we could very well see some sort of a short-term accommodation between the US and China that could leave other friends and allies in the lurch. The current situation with the trade talks is a case in point. And, you know, as we have seen, there's now kind of like a bit of a pause, a 90-day pause, and there is a deal that has been struck that has left China with 30% tariffs, right? But then unless some fresh negotiations and deals are struck for the others in the region, we are now sort of seeing a situation where some Southeast Asian countries are looking at tariff rates higher than China's current 30%. Cambodia with 49%, Vietnam 45%, Indonesia 32%, right? And then at the same time, you also have a situation where regional countries could still find themselves in situations where they are forced to choose. And this is seen with, you know, the US's latest statements on warning against the use of advanced Huawei chips. So where does this leave the region? And I think one stark reality is that, you know, we obviously have to prepare for all scenarios because nothing is certain. But perhaps I think a key bottom line takeaway is that the region will need to seriously prepare to deal with an increasingly strong and potentially more assertive China without counting on the US for any security guarantees, either because the US might throw its allies under the bus, or because the US is actually asking countries to pay a price that is far too costly in choosing the US side. So perhaps I'll just stop there and I'll save my comments about, you know, what the region might do for later part of the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue-Ann. And yes, I'm sure we'll also probably come back to this question of a potential grand bargain, which is very much part of the conversation in DC at this point. But I will turn to Mark now. Mark, thanks for being with us, especially given the late hour in Washington, D.C. You spent a long time in the U.S. government working on China policy and Asia policy more broadly, for that matter. From your perspective, what do you think would be the broad contours of a strategy that would best advance American interests in the region at this juncture? And I should add, not be considered completely provocative by China.
Well, Pierre, thank you so much, and thank you for the opportunity to speak here. I'm going to try to condense this all into as short a period of time as possible. But I want to start it off with manage your expectations about Washington coming forth with a strategy that's easy to understand in the near term. I I like those strategies when I was a practitioner. I like them because it makes it easier to explain what we're trying to do. But I'm not seeing any indication that that's going to be laid out. But if it were laid out, I think it should be composed of 9 components. So let me go through those. First of all, the strategy should be an Indo-Pacific strategy into which you put a China strategy, not the other way around. And the Chinese like you to think, going back to Suan's point about a grand bargain, a G2, that type of thing. That is anathema to US interests, in my opinion. We need to talk about Japan is important because Japan is important. ASEAN is important because ASEAN is important. Not that they are important because of our competition with China. And that ideally we could distill down a strategy that would say, the United States relationship with China is characterized by competition across the board, but we are committed to handling that competition in a safe way so that we can share the planet with the PRC. Second part of the strategy would be we have to start with allies. And this is something that I think a lot of international relations practitioners fail to glom onto. The United States has 7 treaty allies around the world. 5 are in Asia. So Japan, Korea, Australia, the Philippines, Thailand, NATO, which of course is many countries, and the one everyone forgets is the Rio Pact. But I think as we've seen through the last few years, building up the capacity of those alliances is in America's national interest. So you look at what's happened in recent years of the rapprochement between Japan and Korea that culminated in the Camp David Agreement. Hopefully that continues and the Trump administration embraces that. I think Washington got a little bit fortunate that President Marcos in the Philippines was much more open to improving the relationship with the United States, and that we were nimble enough to respond to that. Hopefully that continues. I look at Australia, and particularly with AUKUS. AUKUS Pillar 1 gets a lot of attention because of the focus on attack submarines, but Pillar 2 and the potential of doing joint development of defense items that will include a number of countries in the Asia-Pacific region is very exciting. Thailand, now that it's come out of military rule, and you know this better than I do, Pierre, you're living there, that is a treaty ally of the United States. We have to mend some fences there. I think a big event of the last few years was our American allies in NATO working more closely with American partners and allies in the East Asia Pacific region and looking at common concerns about free flow of commerce, the state of Taiwan, and those types of things. So that's where we have to start. But then you expand that from a Washington standpoint, go beyond the allies and talk about your other key partners in the region. And among these, in no particular order, I would include Taiwan, the Pacific Island countries, Mongolia, Vietnam, Singapore, India, all of whom we've had a very deep discussion about China policy in recent years. I'm hoping that continues. The fourth is then you expand that circle even further to hedging states. And Washington should accept, in my professional opinion, most countries on earth are going to be hedging. They want to have a strong relationship with Beijing. They want to have a strong relationship with Washington. Americans need to be mature enough to just say that's life and understand that. Nonetheless, treat those countries with respect and spell out what it is the United States is seeking to do. The future of our planet, the younger parts of our planet, the places where innovation are going to be coming are Southeast Asia, it's the Middle East, it's Africa, it's Latin America. We should be talking to all those areas about China policy, and to be blunt, just assure them we're not crazy, that we are committed to trying to find a way to work on this. Which gets to my fifth point. We have to lay out a positive vision. It can't be China bad, China bad, China bad. And no one wants to hear that. No one wants to be part of that. It has to be what a close relationship with the United States and our most like-minded countries affords them. And I recognize the irony of my saying this in light of the aforementioned tariffs and other sorts of things. But at our best, we stand for shared prosperity, the free flow of ideas, transparency, the rule of law, enforceable contracts. I hope we can get back to do that. The sixth, which I'm hoping that Crisis Group can do in future papers, is a focus on economic security. I think this was a big change in how Washington views security writ large. Most of my career, the folks who were trained as I was, who came up in traditional security worlds, we worked in our world, and those who worked on trade, technology, and economic issues worked in their world. And in the last few years, I think we've broken down those stovepipes and recognized it's all intertwined. So on economic security, let me put a plug in there. I wish TPP were a thing. It's not a thing. I still hope, and I pray to every divinity I know that it would be a thing. But looking beyond that, I look at a growing recognition of how economic security and how China's ability to weaponize trade and tourism is a real threat. We've seen it in Korea, we've seen it in Japan, we've seen it in Vietnam, we've seen it in Australia, we've seen it in Lithuania, we've seen it in Costa Rica. But in recent years, I think there's a recognition, if we work together to mitigate that risk, that type of bullying actually is counterproductive, and hopefully the Chinese recognize it's not in their best interest. Also under economic security, I would put supply chains. A lot's been written about that, not just the raw materials, but the inputs that we all depend upon. We need supply chains that are reliable and not subject to pandemics or trade friction or other sorts of things. Overcapacity, that was a big issue that we were talking about at the end of the Biden administration about solar panels, electric vehicle batteries. It's still a big issue. Are the Americans still going to work with like-minded countries on that? And finally, on tech, the Chinese have been very transparent. They want to be the global leader for artificial intelligence, quantum computing, cyber, next generation semiconductors. All of these have military applications. And not to put too fine a point on it, I don't think it's in America's best interest to facilitate China being the leader in these areas, developing technologies that can be weaponized to kill Americans or kill American allies. And I think that is a defensible position. It's not one that Beijing likes to hear, but we should talk about that. The next, and again, I realize my sitting in Greater Washington talking about, we have to have a policy about development. I do think it's pretty obvious it was an error on Washington's part to gut the U.S. Agency for International Development before we laid out a China strategy or an Indo-Pacific strategy. Development assistance, not just in food security and in health, but also in building those institutions and helping to build reliable journalists and other types of things, is a vital tool. And yet we have taken that away from ourselves, for at least now. Where are we going to go with development assistance in the future? And I think that's something that has to be wrestled with. My eighth point is, and I think your paper, Huang, points this out, I don't know if Washington's done a very good job of explaining to the American people why the Indo-Pacific region is important. We practitioners and we experts, we understand it, but we need to do a better job of explaining to the people we grew up with why this part of the world is so vitally important to America's long-term security, both physical security and economic security. And then finally, the ninth, let's not forget, we got to talk to the Chinese. Huang, your paper talked about that. I mean, the Chinese don't like a lot of what I just laid out, but we owe them an understanding of this is how we see things. And we would appreciate in return a similar explanation from them, how they perceive us and their interests. So I'm trying to keep that on time. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. And that's a very exhaustive answer. Thank you for that. Lots of food for thought there, as actually the US, the new administration sort of, once again, hasn't really turned its attention to Asia. And I think there's many points in there that they should be looking at indeed. And speaking of which, Ali, if I can ask you maybe to build off a bit of Mark's response. I mean, what do you think the Trump administration at this point could do to better respond to China's growing power in a way that leads to a more stable security environment, while, of course, taking its own national interest into the picture? And provided, of course, that both can overcome the current standoff on tariffs, because that has pretty much crowded out all other topics on the bilateral agenda at this point.
Thanks very much, Pierre. Well, first, I would commend the administration to adopt this nine-part strategy that Mark has laid out. It's a really rigorous and considered enumeration of, I think, what U.S. policy should be, and I find myself in violent agreement, unsurprisingly. And I'll come back to some of the points that Mark made. But Pierre, as a first point, maybe just sort of picking up where you sort of ended your question with I guess right now we're maybe in a trade truce, so kind of an uneasy denouement. The first point would be we need a more decisive resolution of the trade war in a way that enables the resumption of high-level diplomacy, particularly between President Trump, and President Xi. In the Biden administration, of course, the channel between President Biden and President Xi was vitally important. And that bilateral leader-level dialogue was supplemented by, informed by, shaped by a very wide range of dialogues between senior U.S. officials and senior Chinese officials, including, up until very recently, Mark. And I think in this administration, I really do think that given how large President Trump looms in American politics, given the growing concentration of power around President Xi, I do think that bilateral channel between President Trump and President Xi is going to be that much more important than the leader-level channel during the Biden administration. And there were high hopes when President Trump came in, and here I'm going to pick up on some of the remarks that Sue Ann made. When President Trump was then sort of President-elect Trump, he came into office saying that he wanted to reestablish a rapport with President Xi. He spoke of the alleged friendship that he and President Xi had during their first term that was unceremoniously curtailed or derailed, rather, by the coronavirus pandemic. He said, I think shortly before taking office, that China and the United States together could solve all of the problems of the world. He invited President Xi to his inauguration. Now, President Xi declined, but had he attended, he would have been, I believe, the first foreign head of state to have attended a U.S. presidential inauguration. So there were a lot of signs coming in that President Trump, believing in sort of his deal-making prowess, believing in a highly personalistic conception of diplomacy, there were some promising signs coming in. And in fact, up until not even a month prior to Liberation Day on April 2nd, this referring here to the tariff campaign, there was reporting that President Trump and President Xi were planning on a birthday summit. President Trump was born on June 14th, President Xi was born on June 15th. But then Liberation Day came, and I think that we have walked back. We've walked back from what seemed to be this kind of uncontrolled escalatory spiral in the realm of trade, just stratospherically high levels of tariffs on both sides. And kudos really to the U.S. Treasury Secretary, the U.S. Trade Representative, and the Chinese delegation. I think that they made some good progress in Geneva earlier this month. But as I said, it doesn't feel like a definitive resolution. And my concern is that until and unless there is more of a ratcheting down, it's not clear to me that President Trump and President Xi will be able to talk again. And both of them are proud leaders. Neither one of them will want to intimate that he is back down to the other. So we still are in this kind of uneasy period. So all the way of saying the first point would be, Pierre, where you sort of left off your question, turning what is now kind of an uneasy trade truce into a more definitive resolution to pave the way for resuming high-level diplomacy, number one. Number two, and I think here again, I'll sort of echo some of the points that Sue Ann and Mark have already made, and Huang has made as well. I think we need to see a greater cohesiveness of messaging, rather, between President Trump and at least some of his senior advisors. I think that one of the reasons why China might be sensing a window of opportunity to probe or at least test U.S. resolve, maybe test the integrity and the strength of some of America's alliances and partnerships in Asia, is because of that discrepancy between where the president seems to be on alliances and partnerships and where some of his senior advisors are. So If you look at the Secretary of State, also the Interim National Security Advisor, Marco Rubio, if you look at the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, they're saying the right words. They are issuing, I think, assurances that are welcome in Asia about that the United States believes that its alliances and partnerships are sacrosanct, its partnership with Taiwan, its alliance with the Philippines, and of course those messages are welcome. The difficulty is that given how large President Trump looms, if the president himself is casting doubt on those alliances and partnerships, that discrepancy, of course, is going to inform how Asian allies and partners think. And I think that it's notable, even more so this time around than during President Trump's first term, his view of alliances and partnerships, not as strategic assets, but as economic encumbrances. I think that view has really come into even sharper relief. When he talks about Japan, when he talks about South Korea, he says, what do they do for us? We do a lot for them. What do they really do for us? When it comes to Taiwan, which is obviously, as Mark knows, all too well, given his time in the U.S. government, that is the principal flashpoint between the United States and China. And despite the assurances that Secretary Rubio, Secretary Hegseth, and others have offered about Taiwan, President Trump has made pretty clear that he views Taiwan principally in terms of its chip industry rather than in terms of its security. And he notably made a comment recently when TSMC committed or announced that it was going to invest an additional $100 billion in the United States. There was a reporter attending the announcement. He said, well, President Trump, if China were to attack Taiwan, how would you respond? And he famously or infamously said, he said, it would be a catastrophic event, but that's why I'm happy that TSMC has made this additional investment, because it would blunt the impact of that really catastrophic outcome on the American military, the American economy. All a way of saying there has to be greater coordination between what the president is saying about alliances and partnerships, about America's role in the region, and what his senior advisors are saying. And the third and final point I'll make, Pierre, is really to pick up on, I think, a very critical point, maybe sort of blending points 5 and points 9 of Mark's 9-part strategy for China policy. You really can't overstate the importance of a positive vision, of an affirmative vision, the importance of dialogue with China. And I think importantly, since we are the International Crisis Group, we talk about mitigating crises, we talk about opening channels of communication. There's a tendency sometimes in Washington to frame dialogue with Beijing as an act of weakness, a concession. I think it's just prudential behavior that responsible adult countries engage in. We're not talking as an act of charity. We're talking to clarify intentions. We're talking to avoid inadvertent escalations. And then just to close with really just to underscore the point that Mark made about a positive vision or an affirmative vision, I think it's important for the United States to transition away from a policy that can seem China dictated to one that's China informed. And when we engage with allies and partners, rather than having an opening salvo about how we collectively mobilize against China, have a conversation that begins with just shared affirmative purposes. What is it that we can collectively do together to enhance regional security, to manage transnational challenges? Now, of course, China will come up as part of the conversation, as it should, but the opening salvo should be positive sum. What can we collectively do together, rather than articulating it as a first principle what it is we stand against?
Thank you, Ali. And actually, on that, so I want to encourage, the audience to please start sending in your questions if you have any. We'll turn to the Q&A very shortly. But maybe, Mark, to just follow up on what Ali just said, I mean, we're talking about, you emphasize the need to simply talk to China, and that is happening on trade right now, but not much beyond that. But I want to ask you, I mean, we at Crisis Group, of course, look at, conflict risks. And can I ask you, in your experience, what types of channels have historically been most effective in clarifying intentions? Because that's obviously quite central to potential, problems arising from this region, from misinterpretations, really. So yeah, in clarifying intentions and diffusing potential crises, what do you think is the most efficient way in once again, a context when full-on dialogue is not exactly on the table at this point?
I think having the ability for a senior person who speaks for the Chinese leader and the American leader to regularly, quietly talk to each other is vitally important. And over the course of our relationship with the PRC, we've had that. It's often been the National Security Advisor, sometimes the Secretary of State. In China right now, that individual is Wang Yi for both. But also that if you come up with an arrangement there, then you can designate other subject matter experts. For instance, I think it's significant that after the San Francisco summit, there was an arrangement to have working level talks about the need to avoid our ships bumping into each other, our planes bumping into each other. There have been a lot of near misses. And then since November 2023, there have been zero between the United States and the PRC. There have been some others with other countries, but it starts at the top. And that's why I'm of two minds about a President Trump, President Xi channel. Unconventional though it is, the President of the United States is the busiest person on earth. He's not going to be able to dedicate the time that would be necessary to keep up that more regular contact. Perhaps the National Security Advisor or the Secretary of State could, but you need to have that, and then it's done at a lower level.
All right, interesting. And yeah, I mean, under the Biden administration, actually, that channel started to be resurrected with Jake Sullivan having this sort of one-to-one with Wang Yi in various capitals around the world, which served as sort of a back channel, but it was semi-official at the same time, and that was quite a useful channel to use. Once again, to the audience, please do send us in your questions. Maybe I see time is running, so I will run a bit quickly, but maybe Huang, if I can turn back to you for a second. One of the issues that's highlighted in the report is that neither the US or China is particularly explicit about what their respective sort of end game is in terms of military modernization in this region. Can you expand a bit on that aspect of things and why it's problematic in a sense, and what this lack of clarity rather implies in terms of conflict risks in this region?
Thanks, Pierre. Yes, I think China is a little bit more clear in a way that it consistently highlights and layouts actually goals for military modernization and certain thresholds, 2027, 2035, up to 2047, marking its 100th anniversary. And most recently, just mid-May, they issued a new defense white paper reiterating those goals. But at the same time, China also, what China underscores is win-win, community of common destiny, a positive, that's exactly what US is not doing right now, which is positive goals, what both Mark and Ali referred to. But it's not always has reflection in reality. We mentioned some of those actions that really struck security concerns across the region, not only at time the claimant states or the rival claimant states in the South China Sea, but in general, even those who don't have direct claims may find themselves in this cross fires, or so to speak, or being obstructed in their regular conduct of fishery, for example, right? So everybody is at risk and is vulnerable. At the same time, the United States strategy, as we already emphasized several times, there isn't one now. We are running on assumption that the competition is still on, or the basic fundamental principles of what was the free and open Indo-Pacific strategies under previous administration will be carried out. But we don't know that for certain. And there are certain weaknesses already there, as Mark pointed out, insufficiently highlighting the role of Asia rather than just for competition with China, for example. And my point is here that, the world doesn't like void. Void will be filled. And China is doing really good job in filling this void with US withdrawing from the aid agenda, climate change, other multilateral global causes, public health. You know how it was important for the COVID pandemic with assistance of US and partners and allies vaccine initiative. We had Quad vaccine initiative, for example, with quadrilateral security dialogue partners. US still plays an enormously important role globally, whether it is reluctant or not. And we saw it, even though this series will not necessarily focus on the South Asia security environment, but we saw just in May how important the US role was there to mediate what could be a very, very dangerous conflict between the two nuclear-powered neighbors, India and Pakistan, and US role was really immensely important in de-escalating that. So I think that those nuances, either and lay out strategies that not necessarily have coverage in the reality, or lack of strategy layout leaves too much room for interpretation that keeps neighbors, China's neighbors or U.S. Partners and allies on foot, really anxious about constantly trying to interpret and understand the intentions of both major powers and most powerful powers in the region, and the fact that they don't speak to each other sufficiently enough, create even more space for misinterpretation, miscommunication, and that well enough can add to the spiraling effect of security dilemma. So this is something that we highlight in the report that may contribute to further escalation because of that anxiety, because of misunderstanding and misinterpretation of intentions, but not necessarily that it will be an outright conflict. I think one thing we can agree now on is that neither US nor China nor anyone in the region is interested in an outright war. And I think that should be the baseline to start all the conversations to maintain that stability.
All right, thank you, Wong. I see time is running. I do want us to turn to questions from the audience, which are starting to come in. We have this question, which I wanted to put to the panel. We've heard the U.S. Defense and Treasury Secretaries say America first doesn't mean America alone. In the absence of clearly articulated Asia policy, how can we best interpret this? Does the administration lean more prioritizer or restrainer? So, of course, this is a big question for all the allies in the region. I don't know who wants to take this. Maybe Mark or Ali as well, if you want to comment on that, and the others should feel free to as well. Mark first.
Yeah, Pierre, so I took comfort in the fact that Defense Secretary Hegseth went to Tokyo and Seoul on his first trip. That's as it should be. And implying that we will honor our treaty commitments, that's very, very important. And when the Secretary of the Treasury says the same thing, that we will work with our partners, that's vitally important. We had a similar dynamic, I think, in the first Trump administration. Matt Pottinger said some very good things. But again, there's one voice that matters. And you need to have the president underscoring this. Otherwise, there will be doubt, and there will be people in Beijing and elsewhere whispering in the ears, well, the Americans aren't sincere.
Yeah, Pierre, just to echo, completely, or underscore completely what Mark said, I don't think that you can overstate, the importance of that discrepancy. And again, we saw this dynamic during the first Trump administration. And so, when you talk to folks and say, well, let's reflect on sort of the first Trump administration's China policy. If you look at, say, the national security strategy that was published in late 2017, the national defense strategy that was published in 2018, if you look at various statements that then Secretary of State Mike Pompeo made and others, there was, again, a discussion of a return to sort of a period of great power competition. Xi Jinping, in the characterizations of certain officials, he has pretensions to global dominance. He's sort of enthralled to this Marxist-Leninist ideology. This is a global competition. It's highly ideological. And then you saw President Trump seemingly taking a quite different tack, referring to President Xi as a good friend, adopting a rather narrow sort of conception of strategic competition. And I think here, again, granted, it's a different sort of roster of senior officials, but I think that dynamic or that tension that Mark was getting at is very much already in evidence. And so, again, we have statements from the Secretary of Defense, from the Secretary of State, now dual-hatted as International Security Advisor. But as Mark said, it really is the president's voice that matters, not only matters the most, but I would argue matters even more decisively this time around than it did during the first administration. And my sense, just to elaborate a little bit more, is you have competing camps. And I think I've seen different sort of breakdowns or different taxonomies of the emerging camps within the administration, but I'll just talk about a few of them. I think if I were to sort of identify them, so I'll leave President Trump to the side for just a minute, but take, say, the Secretary of State, also dual-hatted as the International Security Advisor, Marco Rubio. It's worthwhile actually going back to the testimony that he gave when at his confirmation hearing, and he spent, I believe, most of his time discussing what he believes is the paramount sort of security challenge to the United States, the paramount economic challenge to the United States, what he believes is that posed by China. And Secretary Rubio, I think, envisions strategic competition in literally an existential way. If you go to his testimony, he says, along current trend lines, in his assessment, along current trend lines, conflict between the United States and China over Taiwan is likely by the end of this decade. Along current trend lines, if the United States doesn't do more to excise China from its supply chains, within a decade, the ability of Americans to purchase and access vital commodities will be basically at the behest of China. In Secretary Rubio's conception, competition, it is global, it is highly ideological, and it really is zero-sum. There will be a winner, there will be a loser. So that's, I think, Secretary Rubio embodies or is a representative of maybe one camp. I think a second camp, perhaps somewhere between kind of the existentialist camp and perhaps where President Trump is, I would put here the Vice President, J.D. Vance, and the recently confirmed Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Bridge Colby. And I think that the two of them, one of their starting premises is that the United States relatively just doesn't command the influence that it did 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and therefore, by virtue of necessity, the United States has to be more exacting in its strategic priorities. It needs to focus much more on China. It needs to focus much more on competing with China in Asia rather than trying to compete with China globally. And the two of them argue that America's principal objective has to be the avoidance of great power war, principally over with Taiwan being the most likely recipient. And the two of them argue that, look, if the United States avoids war over Taiwan, if the United States is able to reduce China's role in its supply chains, maybe there's some possibility of a modus vivendi between the United States and China in Asia. And then last, but certainly not least, in fact, most importantly, there's the president himself. And as I already said a few minutes ago, I think that President Trump, I think unlike some of his senior advisors now, and unlike some of the senior advisors he had in his first administration, he takes a rather narrow view of strategic competition. I think that his first and foremost grievance against China continues to be the size of its trade surplus vis-a-vis the United States, and he believes in tariffs as a corrective measure for producing a more balanced bilateral economic relationship. He also has expressed concern about China's continued export of fentanyl precursors. But once you get outside of those two grievances, I don't get the sense that the president himself views strategic competition in global, highly ideological zero-sum terms. So all the way of saying there are competing camps that are shaping the administration's views, but President Trump's views, I think, do loom largest and even more so than in his first term.
Yes, thank you, Ailey. And I think we're actually getting some, not necessarily questions, but comments about that, about, how can Trump be considered reliable? He says one thing and then contradicts himself, hasn't lived up to past agreements, etc. But maybe turning back to you, Sue-Ann, actually, about how this is all impacting other countries in the region, because you touched upon this a little earlier, but maybe if we can come back to that a bit and the agency of countries in the region, which is something that we'll be, we're trying to also work on in more detail as part of the series that we're working on, looking at different countries here. But how would you say that regional middle powers, as we've now, I think, collectively called them for many of them, how are they preparing themselves for this increasingly tense environment? And I would add this high level of uncertainty as to how things will evolve from here in terms of U.S. China competition, and of course, particularly in Southeast Asia.
Thanks. I wanted to pick up on some of the important sort of points Ali was making, which is the point that, President Trump takes a much more narrow view of strategic competition that is, less ideological, let's say. And actually, I think this presents an opportunity. I think because, in a sense, it makes it easier potentially. This is that window of opportunity for actually some constructive talks to happen between the US and China without too much of the ideological overlay, which was actually, frankly, also deeply troubling the region. If you remember the Biden's AI diffusion framework, and all of these things. A lot of things were, in a sense, over-securitized, and there was a deep ideological overlay with it, which actually, I think, quite a lot of countries in the region don't particularly appreciate. So maybe that's just one point. It's a bit of a contrarian point, but at least certainly from a Chinese perspective, I would sort of say this, presents a tactical window of opportunity to find some sort of off-ramp. And I think the rest of the region, to some extent, should actively try to support that. Because the outcome of, kind of like uncontrolled conflict, whether in the economic sphere or even on the ground, is worse. So that's one point. So the second point, though, is that we are already seeing the region adjust over the years to this dynamic of U.S. retrenchment, in a sense. You see it consistently in the State of Southeast Asia survey that the perception of China's growing importance as influential, strategic, political, and economic power looms large. When we ask a State of Southeast Asia survey to the ASEAN respondents, consistently over the years, the China is ranked as the more influential strategic, political, and economic power compared to the US. While the reality may be different, the perception is that China is the big power in the region that we all have to deal with. The region isn't particularly comfortable with this idea, right? Because when you see, when we ask the question, if forced to choose, who should ASEAN align with? And you kind of like see that there's been a trend generally still in support of aligning with the US. And we saw a huge drop in the previous couple of years to the point where China was actually marginally more favored. But then this year, the US sort of like has picked China again to be sort of like the more favored power to align with. And this kind of shows that there is still deep regional anxieties about what kind of power China will be. But absent the US, consistency, or, the fact that we just don't know where the US is going for all the reasons that have been discussed, I think what you're going to see over the next few years is that the region will increasingly do things to keep the peace with China, and ensure that the relationship with China stays stable and constructive, and in a sense, life goes on. In a sense, if you wanted to put it in competitive terms, then I would say that, in a sense, China has won, just because the US has removed itself from a lot of the mechanisms, or has not been able to give the kinds of reassurances the region needs. And then separately, I think what we have also started to see is that the region is trying to maintain its sense of agency and control, and you will see much more multi-aligned kind of strategies, seek to join the OECD and BRICS at the same time, where Indonesia is concerned, and do what it can to work with, like-minded countries in smaller areas, whether it's trade, other minilaterals. And what you also see very clearly is a desire to see ASEAN as a region just become more internally resilient and greater integration. And I think the biggest card that the region can play, or has in its favor, is the fact that it's a huge market. It's slated to be the 4th largest economy in 2030. That's a big card that ASEAN as a whole has, I think. And I think, we have seen the region try to do all it can to shore up that resilience and that level of integration, to be able to have some cards to play in this big bargain. So I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Yeah, indeed. I think the point you're highlighting about the economic importance of the sub-region is something that definitely ASEAN should be capitalizing on. At the same time, I would also add to that it requires ASEAN to stay united, particularly in facing China. And when we see, the code of conduct negotiations and so forth, for example, it's not always completely homogenous amongst ASEAN. I think that's a challenge for the grouping in coming years. I see time is running. Maybe one last question that has come from the audience, from Mr. Ivan Garcia, who's the retired Philippine diplomat, and who asks, there is some welcome continuity in U.S. East Asia, West Pacific policy. I'm adding, I guess, for now. Is the U.S. Asia policy cadre capable of keeping President Trump on track? So this is a question more, are the sort of professional diplomats that run these shows day to day, beyond the debates that you talked about, Ali, particularly with different views at the higher levels of the administration, can we count on the continuity of the diplomatic service and the State Department to at least maintain some stability? And I guess I would address that to Mark, who has a long experience on that field.
Well, I don't have a crystal ball, but I can assure you that when we're talking about a country like the Philippines, we were all excited at particularly after the difficulties our bilateral relationship with Manila went through, when we had this new opportunity. And I think we were nimble enough to respond and work with our Filipino allies to help build it up. Look, I don't want to soft sell it. It is a time of uncertainty at the State Department. There are a lot of people worried about their own professional futures and other things, but I don't hear anyone saying Asia is not important. I don't hear anyone saying that, when we're looking at the parts of the world where we ought to be cutting back. I'm not hearing that. Now, I could be wrong, but I don't think I am on this. And again, it goes back to what I was saying earlier. The Philippines is important because the Philippines is important. It's not important solely because of the role of China. And as Suan said, I mean, look at the market that ASEAN together is going to be, not just for our generation, but for our children's generation. We've got to think about these things more long term, and I think we will. Will there be some bumps in the road? Perhaps, but this is a very diplomatic way of saying, if I'm in Las Vegas, I'm going to bet that we're still focused on the Philippines and other countries in that neighborhood.
All right, thank you, Mark, and that sort of ends, in a sense, on a somewhat positive note, given the level of uncertainty. In the reassuring notes, given the level of uncertainty that we see in this region, particularly amongst our U.S. allies, but not exclusively. I'm afraid time is up, so I'm going to call this to an end. I want to thank our speakers. I think we managed to cover quite a bit of ground today. Of course, there's plenty more to explore. I would actually encourage our audience also to go to our report that we mentioned early on this call, where a lot of the things that we touched upon here are fleshed out in more detail. Thank you once again to our panelists. Thank you to the audience joining from various parts of the world. And once again, the event will be recorded and available soon on our YouTube channel and our website. Don't hesitate to refer people to it if you thought it was an interesting conversation. And do look out as well if you are following these issues for the upcoming reports in our series that will be looking at more individual countries in the region after this opening report. Thank you again to everyone, and see you next time. Thanks.